Well, welcome back, everybody. And today we're going to be looking at Chapter 9 and 10, primarily Chapter 9, as we take a look at surveys and respondents and some of the errors that can take place when you're trying to do face-to-face interviews and also when you're trying to collect data via email or internet or other areas of resources for this type of methodology. So let's go ahead and start today with Chapter 9 and 10. Okay, everyone, today we're going to be looking at Chapter 9 and 10. There's not a whole lot in Chapter 10 that I think bears mentioning. You do need to read the chapter, but we're going to cover primarily Chapter 9, and then we'll get into a couple of slides in Chapter 10. Now, today we're going to be looking at an overview of survey research. Now, a couple of terms that you need to understand when it comes to survey research. You need to be aware of respondents, and these are the ones who verbally answer your questions, the interviewer's questions, or provide answers to written questions. So these are the objects of your interview or your survey. They're the people you go up to. They're the ones that you mail a questionnaire to or whatever. So respondents are the ones who are giving you the information or data that you're needing. Now we have with that a sample survey and a survey that emphasizes contacting respondents who are a representative sample of the target population. So what we mean by a representative sample of the target population would be, well, let's say, for instance, you are in Memphis, Tennessee, and you wanted to find out who likes Tops Barbecue as opposed to Rendezvous Barbecue. And instead of canvassing all of Memphis, which would be a tremendous endeavor, you're going to get a representative sample. You're going to select a number that would fairly well represent what all of the citizens of Memphis would choose. And that would be a target population. Now, there are surveys objectives, and the surveys are trying to answer questions. They attempt to describe what is happening, what people believe, what they like, dislike, or to learn the reasons for a particular business activity, what have you. There are different reasons for doing surveys. Your research will determine what type of survey that you do, and a survey research is descriptive research. It identifies characteristics of the target market. Who is buying your product? Who is not buying your product? At what times are they buying your product, and in what volume? These types of things can be understood and discovered using surveys. You can measure consumer attitude. What's your attitude towards this product, or what's your attitude with the political parties that are going at it day after day? You know, we get a lot of these polls from consumers, we get a lot of these political polls from people who fill out surveys. So you want to identify information regarding activities that could make the company more green. So that would be a way of being able to look at different strategies that you might consider for that one objective, and that's to make the company more green. So you would use a survey to do that. Now, surveys can be both quantitative, which is using numerical data, and qualitative, which is more experiential, where you get to derive meaning from the interviews that you conduct with the respondents. Now, the advantages of surveys, well, they can be quick, depending on the how extensive the research is, inexpensive. It really just takes an investment mainly of your time, and, of course, the survey itself, it's efficient, which means that you're not wasting a whole lot of time on unnecessary procedures and so forth, and it's accurate. What they say is really what you're going to record. So there are definite advantages to using surveys. Now, just with anything else, there's always errors, and there are errors in survey research. For instance, we have the error of random sampling, and that means that something has happened in the population group that you have chosen to take part in the survey. Now, random sampling, the goal of random sampling is, as the name implies, you want to get as random a population group as you can get. You don't want there to be any, let's say, bias in the studies that you're conducting. For instance, if you are, now that we're in the political season, or whenever a political season comes about, you have a lot of times companies that will go and they will take a primarily Democratic area and survey them. Who is your favorite to win? Well, that's not really a representative or random sample. If I handpick you, then that's not a random sample. If the way that I choose you is not completely random, then you have a sampling error. And folks, it is very difficult to completely randomize your population group. About the only way you can do it is to use computer programs that just pick numbers out of the air. For instance, you couldn't even put names in a box, because normally when your hand goes in a box, it's going to go a certain way. It may always lean to the right and go down towards the lower right-hand corner. Well, if that's the case, then all of the other corners and the middle never got a chance. So that's how difficult it is and how complex it can be when you're looking at random sampling. So usually you use computers to choose people or numbers that represent people and so forth. Systematic error. These are the errors resulting from some aspect, an imperfect aspect of the research design that causes respondent error. Or it can be from a mistake in the execution of the research. Maybe you didn't interview everybody or survey everybody that should have been surveyed. There might have been, in your research design, the pick it out of a hat method of finding people as your random sample. So anything that would involve the inaccurate or imperfect design of the study, the survey itself, would be a systematic error. And then sample bias, and that's a persistent tendency for the results of a sample to deviate in one direction from the true value of the population parameter. Again, if I went to a predominantly Republican area and started to survey people, of course, there's going to be a sample bias. And those are errors because you're not getting true, accurate information. You're getting biased information. Now, some other errors you have are respondent error, and this is something that results when you don't get any response or response bias. So the person, they're already biased in their opinion. Non-response error, and that's the difference between a survey that includes only those who responded and a perfect survey that would also include those who failed to respond. Now, you also have non-respondents, people who just refuse to cooperate. They're either not at home or they don't want to talk to you. I've had that happen in my dissertation. People just didn't want to get involved. So they decided not to take part in the research at all. And then self-selection bias, and that occurs because people who feel strongly about a subject are more likely to respond to survey questions than people who feel indifferent about it. If you really don't care about the outcome or the study itself, you may not be that enthused or that involved in the research. So you may either just half-heartedly answer questions, or you may not answer them at all. Deliberate falsification occurs when people give deliberate false answers. And as you see here, it can pertain to misrepresenting answers to appear intelligent, concealing personal information, or they want to avoid embarrassment. And here you see the average person hypothesis. Individuals may prefer to be viewed as average, so they alter their responses to conform more closely to the perception of the average person. So you may have people who are, I know a lot of times when I was in school, undergraduate school, getting my degree in psychology, we would interview, or I did interview some people who had schizophrenia, or who the doctors diagnosed as having schizophrenia, and they tried to appear as normal as they could. Now their disease, that schizophrenia, that broken personality started coming out, and they were rambling on and doing this or that, but they did everything they could to try to answer questions and talk and have a discussion like a normal person. And a lot of times they'll put on that fake facade. Unconscious misrepresentation. Here's where a person is trying to be truthful and cooperate, but they may not have understood the question. They may be unable to recall details. They may be unprepared for an unexpected question. They may not be able to translate feelings into words. And after event underreporting. Now, I had some who I interviewed for my project, for my paper, and some of them were just not ready to translate their feelings into words. I was doing a case study, and I surveyed some of the faculty and staff, and this college had really left a bad impression on them, and they were still so upset, and this had been several years after the fact. They were so upset about the experiences they went through that it was hard for them to put into words exactly what they were feeling. So all of these things can happen. Now, the response bias. We've looked at the respondent bias, we've looked at survey bias, and we can also look here at response bias, and we have acquiescence bias. And that's a tendency to agree with everything you ask. Oh, yeah, I agree, or that's fine, or whatever. Extremity bias, the tendency of some individuals to use extremes when responding to questions. I'm always upset, and I could choke that person because I'm mad at them and whatever, or that product has never lived up to its call or its promotion or whatever. So you get extremity bias, interviewer bias, and that's the presence of the interviewer influencing the respondent's answer. I never will forget, this was during the Clinton administration, and the practice of third trimester or late term partial birth abortion came up. This is when it first came into prominence. And people wanted to voice their opinion. Washington or the White House opened up response lines, and they were taking surveys of people who supported this practice or those who were against it. And I was livid when I first heard about that. And the way that they worded the question was, when I called, they said, "Thank you for calling," and This is in response, or this line is dedicated to people and their attitude towards this issue. And we would like to know, are you for or against a woman's right to choose? And that was it. They didn't term the late birth abortion. In fact, it was really worded in such a way: do you not believe a woman has the right to choose what happens to her body? It was something like that, where the interviewer, the person asking the question, was clearly trying to steer people away from the main issue, which was partial birth abortions. Now, you have social desirability bias, and this is caused by respondents' desire, conscious or unconscious, to gain prestige or appear in a different social role, making themselves out to be more than what they are, and they try to elevate themselves in front of the interviewer, so that evidently they're trying to satisfy their esteem needs or whatever. Now, administrative errors can happen also, and it's just the improper administration or execution of the research task. You have data processing error, which is caused by incorrect data entry, sample selection error. You design the selection or the sample model in a wrong way, and that's going back to random samples and so forth. There was something in your design that prevented a completely random sample from being achieved. Interviewer error. These are interviews that went wrong because of the interviewer making mistakes. You didn't record the information correctly. I never will forget, one of the first times I started interviewing was when I sat down with a Muslim and I started talking, and we were about 20 minutes into the interview before I remembered that, or I noticed that I had never turned on the recorder. So we had to go right back from scratch. So there are all types of human error that can take place, both with the interviewer and the respondent. And then interviewer cheating, which is filling in fake answers or falsifying questionnaires by an interviewer. And this has happened in research, and whenever it's discovered, the person is deemed untrustworthy. Their reputation is shot, and many of these who are professionals in these fields lose their credentials altogether. So it's not good to cheat. Let the data say what it's going to say, and let the chips fall where they may. But you, as a researcher, you're not there to bias. You're not there to really push an opinion. You're there to present a hypothesis and test whether or not that hypothesis is true, and then record and communicate the results. That's what you're getting paid to do when you go into this field. Now, when it comes to research methods, when you are interviewing or when you are giving out a questionnaire, your questions will either be structured or unstructured. A structured question imposes a limit on the number of allowable responses. Are you a male? Yes or no. Did you work at XYZ company? Yes or no. How long were you an employee at whatever job? What is your position? Structured questions don't allow for you to do anything other than just give the specific answer that it's asking. Unstructured questions are open-ended questions, and you can put as much in as you feel is necessary. Describe an event where you demonstrated strong leadership, and there you go. People love to talk about themselves, and that's really one of the downsides to it, but it's also a benefit because they're giving you all the information that you need unhindered, and the way that they see it. Now, there are undisguised questions and disguised questions. Undisguised questions assumes the respondent is willing to answer. So you're forthcoming. There's nothing that you need to hide. Disguised questions assume the purpose of the study must be hidden from the respondent. So, for instance, if you are, let's say, if the company is ready to lay off a large portion of the personnel, and they're wanting to know the attitudes and all of that of the people to make the final determination if they should do something drastic in the organization or keep it as it is. Well, you're not going to tell that employee, hey, the company's getting ready to shut down. How do you feel about this, that, or the other? So you may have to disguise the questions. Now, some of the other research methods, you have a cross-sectional study. And this is done at a single moment in time. That's critical for you to understand. A cross-sectional study is a comparative study, pretty much, where you compare one thing against something else at that moment in time. You did let's say, a cross-sectional study on the population density of Memphis, and you wanted to know how many African Americans as opposed to how many Caucasians or Latinos. That would be a cross-sectional study. You are studying different population groups or different items at the same time and comparing them. Now, a longitudinal study, as you see here, is a study that occurs over time. For instance, you may do a 5-year study on the growth of the operations department at your company, and you would take the data and you would each year come back and analyze each year if there's any growth or if there's any lack of growth or whatever. So a longitudinal study is something that is tracked over time. You may take a look at how people do with online courses as compared to people who go to residential courses, and over the course of their bachelor's degree, how they did. That would be, and compare them, and that would be a longitudinal study. And a consumer panel is just a survey of the same sample of individuals or households to record their attitudes, behaviors, or purchasing habit over time. They're writing down, they're journaling all of their activities so that you can collect it and compare the data. Now, Chapter 10, as I said, is very simplistic. The majority of this talks about the different ways to communicate, such as email, such as door-to-door, or mall. You've probably been to the mall and seen people try to come up to you and ask you some questions. These are usually marketing professionals who are trying to get spending habits. So I'll let you guys read all of that, but there are a few items that I do want to cover here. The first is the interactive survey approach. This allows spontaneous two-way interaction between you and the respondent. Here's where you are interviewing them. Hey, how was your experience over at the Gap? I don't even know if the Gap exists now. Or how was your experience at Bass Pro Shop? And they talk to you, and then you can ask more questions. Well, you say you didn't have that great of an experience. Why? And so there's two-way interaction there. And it can be personal or electronic. Non-interactive media, those that do not facilitate a two-way communication and are largely where you give answers to static questions, and you see down here the questionnaire that just asks you closed questions, structured questions. Self-administered mail and internet surveys are also an issue as well, or an item as well. Personal interviews, that's direct, face-to-face. I don't know of any other more effective way to find out what a person is feeling or going through than the face-to-face interview. It's during the personal interview that you can pick up on cues. You can clarify comments, things that you wouldn't normally be able to do with a regular questionnaire or a mail out. You can accomplish with a face-to-face interview. And it also lends itself to opening up other avenues as well. So I learned a great deal about Islam while talking to these people who converted from Christianity to Islam. And this interview would start out with open-ended questions. Well, I had both structured and unstructured, but once we got through the demographic information, which was structured, I would ask them, for instance, tell me about your conversion to Christianity, because I wanted to know how could they call themselves Christians and yet abandon Christianity for this obvious anti-Christian religion. So I wanted to establish some type of background on them, and I gave them time to talk. And one question led to another, but they would have different responses that I would try to have them elaborate on. For instance, one said that, well, Christianity is filled with contradictions. And if that was just a questionnaire, then, and I mailed it out, I wouldn't be able to have them talk about these inconsistencies. And I asked a person, what is inconsistent about the Bible? Give me an example. And then he mentioned Genesis, where God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and on the seventh day he had to rest because he was tired. And I said, this is what you believe God resting meant? And then I had him go and elaborate a little bit more on that. So it opened up avenues that I would not have had access to had I not sat down with them face to face. Now, the downside to it is that it can get time consuming. I would mark out an hour, but sometimes I was there 2 or 3 hours. And a lot of it, in all fairness, is because I was just fascinated with the responses. I didn't want to leave. But it also required me going to the people or meeting them in a place. So that can cost money and gas and time and all of that. So there are definite pros and cons to personal interviews, but I believe the pros far outweigh any negative event or consequence that comes with personal interviews. Well, today, everyone, we had a chance to look at surveys and how convenient and easy they can be when you're trying to collect data. We also looked at sampling errors and respondent errors and interviewer errors. Well, there's no getting away from the potential for errors to exist. So hopefully, if you use this type of model for collecting data, you'll be aware of those problem areas and be able to develop stronger strategies to make sure that your surveys and your data is not corrupted. Well, that's all we have for today. We'll be back tomorrow. So until then, you have a good day.